Hi, all. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Maya Hammond. I'm an Associate Director at the Cyber Statecraft Initiative within the Atlantic Council's tech programs. We have a great lineup of speakers today, so I'm going to get over to hear from them post-haste. But first, I just want to thank you all for being here to share in this discussion. Figuring out how to design and build more secure software is an interesting topic for me and for all the panelists that you'll hear from today. But it's also an urgent issue for the wider world. Consumers interact with software every day. You're probably using software to watch this video right now. Businesses rely on software to deliver goods and services. Critical infrastructure relies on software to deliver electricity and water and to move goods across the United States. The government relies on software to deliver its services to its citizens. Insecure software threatens all of those functions. The makers of software ultimately control many aspects of its security, from the code they author, which may have bugs or vulnerabilities, to the settings and features they provide. Things like providing multi-factor authentication that can help secure user accounts, or giving businesses access to logs, the data that they can use to identify intrusions. CISA's Secure by Design initiative is a recognition of these critical facts, and it's really premised on the belief that by pushing software makers to do better, we can create a more secure world. Many questions remain about the practices themselves and the broader pathways to adoption, and we'll get into one very quick point of housekeeping for our audience. At the end of this panel, we're going to have time for an audience question and answer session. We'd encourage you to go to the URL askac, that's ask, the letter A, the letter C.org, and click on today's event, the Secure by Design Imperative. That'll allow you to drop in questions as they occur to you during the remarks in the panel, and we'll kind of get back to those at the end question and answer session. And I will say that URL again, so don't worry. To open this session, we're going to hear some recorded remarks from the Director of the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, Jen Easterly. Director Easterly has been a major proponent of the Secure by Design initiative since its launch a year ago, and we're very grateful to hear from her today.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today to mark the 1-year anniversary of Secure by Design, with special thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting today's event. We started talking about the importance of securely designed tech in an address at Carnegie Mellon University a little over a year ago. That address launched our team's effort to ignite a national movement towards technology that is secure by design. Given the unprecedented level of cyber threats targeting our government and critical infrastructure, from nation-state actors to cyber criminal groups, the time has come to take action in a manner that measurably reduces the most common sources of cyber attacks. And do something about it, we are, which is why we're here today. A year ago, my team at CISA and a number of our domestic and international partners published our first guidance on Secure by Design. In it, we laid out a vision aligned to the National Cybersecurity Strategy for a more secure future, where tech manufacturers drive the development of secure products. The vision is to shift the security burden from individuals and small businesses, in other words, end users, to those technology manufacturers who are more capable of addressing and managing cybersecurity risks. I'm really proud of the progress that we've made over the past year. In a short period of time, we've created momentum around Secure by Design that has thrust it into the national conversation in tech and policy circles, and really is the clearest answer for addressing some of the most pressing cybersecurity challenges facing the country. The cybersecurity incidents we read about every day in the news are helping drive that conversation. More than ever, people understand that blaming the victim isn't a real solution to an enduring problem. We can't keep issuing PSAs to patch harder and expect something new. As I mentioned in recent congressional testimony on threats from the People's Republic of China, the incident response cycle we're in is necessary but insufficient. We can only achieve long-lasting safety through fundamentally more secure software. So, To help with this framing, we've been stressing the need to focus on entire classes of software vulnerabilities. We continue to be surprised by zero-day vulnerabilities, but the reality is that most aren't anything new. They belong to known classes of vulnerabilities that we almost always know how to prevent at scale. These realities are what led us to create our Secure by Design alert series, which places the focus on emerging incidents squarely on actions that technology manufacturers can take to prevent them in the first place. One of the recent Secure by Design alerts was on SQL injection vulnerabilities, which we continue to see widespread exploitation of, including some of the most widespread ransomware extortion campaigns over the last year. Despite the fact that software developers have been able to prevent these for over 20 years. In the past few months, we've also put out guidance with international partners on areas like memory safety, emphasizing how technology manufacturers can eliminate the most common classes of software vulnerabilities by using memory-safe programming languages. And to help us foster greater adoption of Secure by Design principles, last year we announced a Secure by Design pledge with leading education technology manufacturers who committed to taking concrete actions to drive Secure by Design outcomes for their customers. Finally, I want to note we've been working to help ensure a secure and sustainable open source ecosystem, which is especially important in light of the recent XC compromise. In March, we held a summit with the open source community where we ran a tabletop exercise on responding to a vulnerability affecting the open source ecosystem. We released these materials publicly so that any open source community can test their response to open source incidents like the XC compromise. We've also worked with the open source community to publish the principles for the security of package repository frameworks, which can play a critical role in scaling out security improvements but are often under-resourced themselves. At our summit, we highlighted how 5 major package repositories are taking steps in line with our framework, raising the tide for everybody. The XC compromise showed the criticality of sustaining open source projects and communities. In line with our Secure by Design vision, I call on every software company capitalizing on open source software to continue to give back to the ecosystem we get so much value from, whether through employee time or financially. But as proud as I am for the work that we've done to date, there is so much more to do. As we head into our second year of the Secure by Design revolution, we at CISA plan to do the following in support of this vision. 1, continue to educate the public and industry on Secure by Design. 2, continue to drive adoption and get commitments from tech manufacturers. 3, continue to develop and issue technical guidance and approaches. 4, drive awareness and a Secure by Demand approach to ensure customers can push their vendors to do better. 5, work to understand the costs and other economic forces that impact software security and insecurity. 6, work with academic and educational communities to incorporate security into computer science programs and self-taught programming pathways. And finally, number 7, continue working with the open source community to drive a Secure by Design approach to open source development in line with our open source roadmap. But we can't do it alone. I'm really grateful to the many partners across industry, civil society, the open source community, and academia who've already stepped up. Secure by Design is our best hope for a more resilient future. I look forward to seeing measurable results from technology manufacturers over the coming months and years as they continue to put our Secure by Design principles in action. Thank you.
Welcome back. Next up, we're going to hear from 2 of our invited speakers today who really work on the ground on the Secure by Design initiative. Jack Cable is a senior technical advisor at CISA, and Lauren Zabrick, a senior advisor. They'll share with us some reflections on the past year of Secure by Design at CISA. Jack, Lauren, the floor is yours, and thank you for being here today.
Great. Thanks for having us, Maya. I'll maybe pass it over to Lauren to kick it off.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining and continuing our birthday celebration for Secure by Design. Unfortunately, I forgot cake again today, so I can't share that with the audience. But I think that the director's video was just really powerful and really instructive, and she covered so much of what we've done over the last year, and of course, it looks ahead too. And so I just wanted to touch on a few things just to emphasize. I'm sure many of you caught the director's testimony at the hearing on the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that moment was so crystallizing for us when she mentioned that CISA had found and eradicated PRC intrusions into our critical infrastructure. But she linked that to the well-known, easily exploited defects in software as the primary enabler of those intrusions. And so that, I think, was something that just really solidified and really crystallized this movement, just showing the immediacy of these threats. But I also wanted to touch on just a couple of other things. I think when people start to hear about Secure by Design, I think they say, yes, that makes sense, but what's it going to cost us? And so what I would really encourage people to do is sort of step back and consider a couple different things. First, consider the full picture of the costs. Right now, the customers are bearing most of those costs to compensate for insecure technology. And so we're not asking for all of that burden to be completely shifted onto manufacturers. We know that customers do have to bear some of the responsibility, just like drivers in a car, right? We can't drive drunk, we can't drive and text, we have to obey the speed limit, things like that. But we know that the car, for instance, is a primary factor in driver safety. So the design of the car and the features therein, such as seat belts and collapsible steering columns and things like that. And so that's what we are really driving towards, to use a pun, with technology. But the full picture really is yes, it will cost some things upfront, but also let's think about the costs that the customers are bearing both left and right of boom to really get that big picture of what the true magnitude of what people are spending on. And then also I would just say, let's think about how much we're going to spend or continue to spend on those sort of recalls versus putting the upfront investment into preventing these exploitable defects from the beginning. I'll also just kind of say that I think people get naturally nervous about innovation, right? We're not looking to create a whole compliance scheme around this. We're just asking manufacturers to take very principled approaches to designing and developing their software and making it secure enough. Preventing, as I said, very exploitable vulnerabilities and misconfigurations, and really working to make things safer and raising the costs to those actors. So just a couple of things wanted to highlight, that I think are on people's minds, and so we can get into some of that, more of that later. But I will now pass it over to Jack for his thoughts too.
Great. Thanks, Lauren, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Like Lauren, super excited to be celebrating the 1-year anniversary of our Secure by Design initiative. As you heard from the director, we launched this just over a year ago, and since then have formed an incredible international coalition of countries across really North America, Europe, Asia, who share this vision with us. And we want to see how we can continue moving the bar forward when it comes to Secure by Design. And as Lauren, as the director mentioned, we really do think that secure by design is the best way to raise the tide for security in the long run. And just to make this crystal clear, given one of the most pressing threats facing our country right now, ransomware, where we see pretty much every day hospitals, school systems, other critical infrastructure organizations getting hit, getting compromised, and leading to real impact to people's lives and livelihoods, we want to see how we can really work to make sure our country is fundamentally more secure. And an observation we have at CISA is that a vast majority of ransomware attacks are enabled by either a software design defect or an insecure default misconfiguration. Ransomware actors are financially motivated cyber criminals. They're going to take the actions that are most cost effective to get their results. And as we have today, that means they can exploit remarkably simple vulnerabilities or misconfigurations to really wreak havoc across our country. How can we change this? One of the big ideas that we are pushing now at CISA is this idea of eliminating entire classes of vulnerabilities, because we know from a technical perspective that it is possible to root out security flaws, entire classes of them, at the source. And I'm sure we'll get into many of these examples, but we like to talk, for instance, about memory safety vulnerabilities, which the director mentioned, the most dangerous class of vulnerabilities we see today, the most common, and they're preventable by using a memory safe programming language. So this is a business decision that business leaders at companies can make to prioritize the security of themselves and their customers. It is a technical problem, but we have many solutions that make this much easier today. So really, we need to figure out how to incentivize businesses to do this right. And getting back to some of the analogies of other industries like the auto industry, this is really, at the end of the day, a transformation that every industry undergoes at one point or another. We know with cars, we saw over time that manufacturers began to take responsibility for the safety of their passengers. And really, we saw safety improve quite dramatically. The software industry is no different and will have to undergo the same transformation to make safety and security a radical priority. And we at CISA view eliminating classes of vulnerabilities, getting to security at the source, as being a really key component of that. So very much looking forward to the discussion today, and thanks to everyone for joining.
All right. Thank you so much, Lauren. Thank you so much, Jack, for that overview. Now we're going to segue right into a conversation between Lauren and Jack and our two other esteemed panelists. So we are joined today by Sarah Novotny. Sarah has deep connections in the open source software ecosystem, and she's worked on large technology infrastructure like the cloud at companies including Google and Microsoft. She now runs her own consulting group, Clever Consulting. We're also joined by Dan Lawrence. He's the co-founder and CEO of ChainGuard, a software supply chain security company, and I've been told a bona fide container geek. He, like Sarah, also has really deep ties in cloud, in open source technology, and those are two areas we're really keen to address today. So we're very honored and thankful to be joined by them. Before I forget, it is always a good time to go to askac.org to keep your questions flowing as our conversation proceeds. So to get started, Dan, Sarah, thank you very much for being here today. And I really want to start with you guys to kind of respond to what we've heard today about the Secure by Design initiative, especially from your perspective and backgrounds, kind of being close to technology, close to industry for a while now. So I'd like to kick it over to you guys to maybe share your responses to what we've heard and to the Secure by Design program overall. What's this approach getting right and what's missing?
Yeah, I'll start. First of all, happy birthday on the 1 year anniversary. I remember when it first came out a year ago, and it's crazy that a whole year has passed since the framework and the principles were released. I remember reading it for the very first time, and I was really impressed by how thorough the approach was, all the principles and everything. And I do think we've seen a notable shift, especially in the discussions around software security. A lot of the words you just used, Jack, a few minutes ago around eliminating entire classes of vulnerabilities. fixing these things at the root. I'm hearing that in conversations with customers, with vendors, with open source projects and open source communities every day. I think it was a really great way to kickstart the conversation. I think where folks are probably missing it a little bit, at least from what I'm hearing on the ground, is it is a long-term approach. It's about secure by design. By design, it covers starting from scratch almost, and it's a great framework that way. But a lot of vendors seem confused about the next steps for existing systems, for legacy systems that they already have in place. And I know that's somewhat out of the scope here because we're talking about securing the next generation of software as we get through this transformation. So I think it's winning in some of those areas. I think folks are still missing some guidance on how to connect it on some of the other ones for existing systems.
Thank you. Sarah, you're muted, for me at least.
I am, and of course it wouldn't be a webinar if someone didn't do that, so I feel happy to have been that person. I think Dan has made a couple of really great points, that this is the future and the forward-looking space that we've really codified very well. And inside large companies, inside small companies, everywhere, there's an education process that's happening. And that's the piece that I have found this most useful for in the last year, is to say, hey, I know we have problems today, and this is where we want to go. And then to be able to tie that back with that education to where are we now. One of my favorite pieces of the framework is transparency. And the fact that we will all have flaws. This isn't a problem that we should hide. It is a problem we need to embrace and engage with in a way that increases trust in software, increases trust in these organizations, and rewards people for making responsible disclosures, rewards people for bringing concerns to their leadership inside a company instead of it being hushed and not talked about as a way to avoid dealing with the challenges. So that's been my favorite part of this. And I think this last year, getting companies to realize that they're that they are able to have these conversations internally and then also with customer bases is something that I think was very much catalyzed by this framework. So super happy to have seen this. As Dan said, happy first year, happy first anniversary. And I really continue to look forward to using all of this work and adding to it as we move forward, not only securing what's next, but also looking back and trying to secure what is today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I want to say I really appreciate the point around transparency from the perspective of civil society, transparency that helps us kind of understand, what barriers people are facing, the relationships between adoption and security outcomes. Those things are really helpful from kind of a research perspective. So I completely agree. Let me ask one follow-up question. Sarah, Dan, have you seen, sort of with respect to adoption, where have you seen kind of success in adopting these principles? And where do you think that there are kind of barriers that industry is still facing in terms of their ability or their willingness to adopt?
I think the memory safety analogy is a great one. I think we've seen so many categories of security like this in the past where eliminating entire classes of vulnerabilities just eventually becomes a no-brainer. Especially when you talk about total cost of ownership and the investment required. Security is just like everything else where you can pay a little bit upfront, which you probably weren't planning to, or deal with a lot higher cost later on. And so we see folks putting this in their budgeting process as the way they think about the overall cost of maintaining software. Memory safety's come a long way just in the last couple of years. So it's a perfect one that we see a lot of folks talking about and discussing today. It's not the first one like this, though. It's just the biggest one we're dealing with today. Things like multi-factor authentication to eliminate phishing. All of the studies have shown that that's basically gone now in organizations that adopt secure multi-factor authentication. Even before that, cross-site scripting and moving to more secure web frameworks to eliminate that entire class has shown that this approach does work, and folks are ready to try it again, especially with memory safety. See that in open source and inside of companies.
There are so many places that we can continue this conversation. I think we are by no means done, obviously. And this different companies, different sizes of companies, different sizes of organizations move at different paces. So you will have the early adopters and the early innovators who are grabbing this and building companies around it, helping the ecosystem learn, educating broadly. And then you'll have larger companies that you have to spend much more time internally poking at the pockets of people who have a fixed culture or have not necessarily adopted the necessary transformation toward a growth mindset of, if someone tells you your software is broken or has a flaw in it, that's a gift. Now, if they do it responsibly, that's an even bigger gift. So my hope is that we start to see this transformation, or continue to see this transformation, in a way that allows us to shine light and sanitize so many more things. Dan's comment about memory safe languages is a great one. It's not a panacea, and no, we're not saying rewrite every piece of code in memory safe languages today. That's not realistic. We have code that's been running 50 and 60 years inside and around the industry. So that's not going to get fixed overnight by any stretch, but looking forward to how can we do better later, while still looking at the pain points today and the existing running software today, and looking to that growth mindset to change how we engage with problems, recognizing it as something that you learn from, you grow from, and you work with your customers to solve, is very different from the software industry of 20 odd years ago or 30 odd years ago, when it was very much more fixed. There was a piece of software and you either enjoyed it or you didn't, and the companies had much more control. This has become much more of a collaboration in the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, you talk
Please.
about culture change in large organizations, and I think we're seeing that too, the rise of DevSecOps, as much as I hate buzzwords. But security and developers used to be in separate organizations, and they came from different mindsets and different backgrounds. And we are seeing that in companies and reorganizations, and sitting CISOs closer to VPs of engineering. That's happening, and I think that's making dramatic outcomes here.
That ties right into alignment of incentives. Because when the incentives are only and always get the feature out, get the new product out, that is very different from incentivizing good maintenance, whether it's your internal dependencies or your open source dependencies. If that is not incentivized, or in the running joke, if that's not part of your promo path, then that will never be a thing that attention is spent on and time is spent on, and goodness knows money spent on. And we know that we need to do that.
Yeah. I really appreciate the point about the importance of kind of like organizational changes and prioritization needing to like kind of accompany, the technical mitigations and being a way to drive those forward, as well as I love the framing of total cost of ownership. Like, I think that's like a very powerful one, in a way to kind of like explain investment in these as actually a business, win and something that's good for the overall organization. Let me turn to Lauren and Jack. I'd be curious to hear, I think, one of the largest questions I think around the Secure by Design initiative is the question of, without a regulatory stick, how can you get adoption beyond, the set of like well-intentioned firms? How do you kind of expand this set of practices across the broader industry? So I'd love to hear a little bit about what you guys have learned in the past year about that model, and kind of how you're thinking about making that work going forward.
Yeah, definitely a key area. We can put out as much guidance as we want, but of course it's only effective as much as software manufacturers adopt it. And for us, really the key aspect of this to start is, how can we get it into the public conversation that insecure software is at the root of really all of these cybersecurity challenges we're facing today. And I think, and I won't kind of declare victory completely, but I think even over the past year or two, we've seen a remarkable shift where there is now a recognition from policymakers at the highest level, from kind of in the public conversation as well, that we do need to look towards seeing how we can dramatically improve the security of the software that we depend on. This was reflected, for instance, in the National Cybersecurity Strategy that the White House published last year, which is a really monumental document in the US cybersecurity policy landscape and calls for a fundamental shift in cyberspace to shift the burden of responsibility from those least capable, whether it's individuals, small businesses, schools, hospitals, you name it, and to those who are most capable. And in the case of our Secure by Design work, that is the technology manufacturers who are able to, again, prevent entire classes of vulnerabilities at the start and really take ownership of the security outcomes for their customers. So I think that we've been at least somewhat successful in driving the public conversation towards insecure software and towards reducing entire classes of vulnerabilities. The question then becomes, how do we really make this shift happen, make companies building software to start to take this more seriously? And I think in some ways we've already seen many early movers. We've kind of had a few key releases, many companies aligning with our Secure by Design guidance. One of the really main areas of this too is looking at, in addition to kind of what we can do at CISA, and of course we're going to be working with directly companies making software and seeing how we can encourage them, push them to do better, and we'll call out successes when we see them. But we also want to see how we can make sure it's not just CISA being the only voice in the room. And to us, one of the most effective levers there is these companies' customers, because of course, that they drive the business decisions they make. And if customers can better make these demands, asks of their vendors for specific kind of security considerations built in from the start, we think we can see dramatic improvements. So we're doing that both at the federal level. People may be familiar with resulting from the president's executive order on cybersecurity. CISA recently published a self-attestation form that companies that sell software to the federal government will be required to attest to their software development lifecycle security practices. So we view that as a key step. But we also want to see how we can spread this broader. We've recently joined an initiative called the Minimum Viable Secure Product, the working group of that, which lays out a simple checklist that companies can use to evaluate and ask the right questions of their vendors. So we're going to keep pushing to see what we can do at the federal government, but we also want to empower businesses and other organizations of all sizes who are buying software to be able to ask the right questions and make good decisions about the security of the software they're using.
Yeah, and I'll just say first, I really wanted to, I know we're going way back, but Sarah, your comment on the transparency issue and how it's a problem that we need to not only recognize but embrace, and that you know, the disclosures and you know, knowing that there are issues, that's a gift. I love that. I love what you said there. I think, you know, that's such a big piece of this you know, educational and cultural change that both you and Dan alluded to earlier, not alluded to, but mentioned earlier. And I think that particular this thing that's happening, I think, is so vital to making this long-term change. And so, but going back to your question, Maya, you know, I think that we also we have to realize that this is not just a technical or technological issue. This is an economics and a policy issue as well. And so we have to really consider the economic forces, you know, as well as supply and demand on the manufacturer side, on the customer side that we're dealing with. You know, looking at things like you know, market concentration, and looking at the things that have really you know, driven the market, speed to market, features, things like that, and really, you know, understand that this is a key issue here. And so we want to be able to shift the supply and demand aspect. And so by supply, we are looking at things like you know, the computer science and the coding workforce. If you checked out Jack's blog from I think probably a month ago, you know, he talks about making computer scientists, making coders a key piece of the cybersecurity workforce because they have such an impact on the cybersecurity of our critical infrastructure. But then, as Jack mentioned, we're looking to really drive security by demand, by raising the awareness and giving customers those resources and the tools to ask for the right thing, as you mentioned, with the minimum viable security product. But I think you can even point to behavioral economics too. I've heard this phrase, so I'm kind of quoting, kind of paraphrasing here. We have to make the secure way the easy and the fast way, and we do that through making investments in things like developer ecosystems, incentives in our people to do the things that we want them to do, and then with customers, right, making sure that they know, again, the questions and things to ask for. But if it's not quick and easy, then those things are going to be really hard to incorporate into the acquisition processes. So I think those are really key elements to look for as we are trying to make some change with, without that quote unquote regulatory stick right now.
That makes a lot of sense. And you've actually perfectly teed up my next question with the observation about the fact that this is a market, this is an ecosystem. I'd be curious to hear any of the panelists' perspectives on other kind of like players or actors in this big, broader cyber ecosystem who CISA might be able to enlist as kind of like allies, or, who might be also aligned behind the secure by design approach. One that came into my mind are, cyber insurers, but I wanted to tap the expertise of this panel to think about within this broader ecosystem, who else is kind of rowing in the same direction.
I think there's a really interesting component of this as to the misaligned incentives and economics of software insecurity right now, not the security side, but the insecurity, which is our researchers are better rewarded if they go to the dark side, so to speak. If they sell a 0-day to some nation state, that is way more beneficial than a thank you and frustrated argument from a big company when they try to report it responsibly. So figuring a way to mix these incentives and bring that gift to a way that is reciprocated with an economic thank you would be an amazing starting point. It's not a new organization, but again, it's that culture shift to get the people who are desperate to help today already moving in the direction that we want them to get them to be give them status and access. This is gamifying the positive use case of finding vulnerabilities. How do you give a researcher status in a community? How do you give the researcher access to people who can get them to help more? How do you get them to be rewarded with an economic incentive for doing good, and not the frustrated, we'll get to it when we get to it, deprioritized game inside larger companies that you sometimes run into, or even smaller companies. To be fair, I'm not picking on big companies in particular, but we don't incentivize the fixing and the security of the software until we are right of boom. Like I have seen many arguments fail but that hasn't been a problem yet. And that's not the way we can look at this now. We can't continue to look at this. That's how we got here.
Yeah, the other one I'll mention, market forces work great for market transactions and software that people purchase, and there's security questionnaires, and vendors are paying a lot of attention to the software they buy, but they don't work well for open source software, right? You don't pay for open source software. People are doing that out of the goodness of their heart or other reasons. And the open source foundations that are around, I think, would be amazing partners for all of this. Folks like the Linux Foundation, the Apache Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, all of the foundations out there that act as stewards and help ensure the security of those open source projects are also great partners for this. No one likes writing insecure software. No one out there writing software is trying to make it insecure on purpose. Resources, training, all of that is even farther left than the vendors come into play. I think would provide an even stronger foundation.
Really glad to hear both of those, and that those were both actually areas that came to my mind of communities that we are working on actively engaging. To start with security researchers, of course, at CISA, we see immense value in the perspective of security researchers to, again, getting back to this idea of radical transparency, one of the secure by design principles. That's only possible if companies are open to feedback from security researchers to let them know where they have vulnerabilities so that they can do better. I myself got into security through bug bounty programs, so really wouldn't have been in this industry at all if it weren't for companies who were willing to let me, as kind of just an independent security researcher, go and give them some help. And to that end, we are actively working on both building and maintaining these relationships at CISA. Just to note a few areas, we are a CV numbering authority of last resort, so called for operational technology, and actively work with security researchers to help disclose vulnerabilities there. We also have what's called our pre-ransomware notification initiative, where we work with security researchers to notify organizations who are imminent targets of ransomware so that they can secure their systems and avoid the consequential damages of a ransomware attack. So this is an area where we immensely value these relationships. And I think there's an aspect of secure by design too, where kind of going the next level of not just doing a one-off fix for a vulnerability or one-off kind of patch of a system, as valuable as those are, but then also seeing what insights we can get from that to more systemically secure our software, such as identifying what kind of initial access points or root causes we can really eliminate at the source. And then getting to the open source community, another area in which we've been really, especially post the Log4j incident, have been working to build up relationships with open source communities. In September, we published our open source software security roadmap, which lays out 4 pillars by which we are really working to both secure the federal government's use of open source software, as well as helping secure the broader open source ecosystem. Just about a month ago, we held our first open source security summit. We brought in leaders from across open source nonprofits, across package repositories, across industry, and really are working on figuring out how we can, at CISA, not control or regulate the open source community, but rather show up as a community member and offer our resources to help. I imagine we'll get into this a bit later, but one of the areas that we tabletopped at that event was a hypothetical vulnerability in an open source package, which, as it would turn out a couple of weeks later, wasn't really all that hypothetical. So we have actively worked with many in the open source community to respond to the XZ compromise. And tying this back into secure by design, one of our biggest calls to every software manufacturer is to be both responsible consumers of the open source software they use, but then also to be sustainable contributors back to these communities, to these ecosystems, because as we know, open source is a public good. It only works insofar as everyone who relies on it contributes to it, helps make it better, helps make it more secure, more sustainable, so we can continue to reap the benefits.
I really appreciate that. And in fact, you kind of led into my next question, which is going to be, let's talk about open source. We have a lot of folks on this call with some expertise there. And I think that the XZ compromise really put into perspective for a lot of us, it's the manifestation of a potential risk that people were worried about could be an attack vector against open source. And we saw it happen. And luckily, because folks are very sensitive to the timing of things, like worse consequences were prevented. But I'd love to hear from anyone on this call who's thinking about this, like, how do you think, like, secure by design, how does this map to kind of open source software? How does it look the same? How does it look different? And how do you think about kind of how we should update after the XZ vulnerability in terms of thinking about kind of the risks and the security of open source software going forward?
Oh, I have so many thoughts. So many thoughts. I think open source is one of those spots where all of this literally ties together, because you have the responsibility of the consumer of open source in balance with the responsibility of the producer of open source, which, by the way, is offered with absolutely no guarantees, no assurance of anything other than here are my bits, the code that you see. So you have a balance of where that responsibility and accountability needs to land. And we also have an education opportunity to remind absolutely every company who consumes open source software, which is, I'm gonna bet here, almost every company on this planet that makes software will consume open source in some way or another. And that responsibility is then becomes a responsibility of recognizing it's not free like sunshine. It is free like a puppy. You can bring it home from the park for $0. But after that, you absolutely have to invest in the maintenance of that software in some way or another, in the health of the ecosystem around that software in some way or another, in recognizing that the maintainers who you refer to and expect things from as the community are potentially engineers in your company, in other companies, and are needing that support and needing that resourcing in order to make a resilient piece of software. This is exactly where this all intersects. It intersects with the economics of software that we had Lauren bring up, because we can't merely build the best possible software in a given day, because to Dan's point, you don't wake up in the morning and say, you know what I'm going to write today? I'm going to write a piece of really bad software. How about that? Insecure all the way. That's what I'm going to get done before 10 a.m. You can't, people don't do this. Humans and that culture change of rewarding better behavior, of rewarding people calling out flaws and feedback instead of saying, no, we just need to get this through to the launch because the launch is on Tuesday and I don't have time to rewrite this. Our incentives are completely misaligned, and the culture needs to change around all of this. So to my way of thinking, absolutely everything we've talked about lands together at open source in this.
Yeah, open source is both. I go back and forth every day on whether it's part of the XE thing or whether it's completely separate. They intersect, but somewhat orthogonally. It's a really tricky one. First of all, you have to say the XE attack was not unique to open source. This happens to closed source software all the time, and we don't find out about it. Open source is not insecure. We always have to repeat that one. This was detected because the source code was open source. It was quickly diagnosed, remediated, and fixed with the 50 best reverse engineers on the planet working over their weekend because this was open source. The same thing happens in closed source proprietary software all the time. People go get jobs at companies get bought, products get bought, and backdoors get inserted all of the time. So open source is really well positioned to deal with things like this. Like we just saw, the tabletop exercise you did a month before was perfect timing, just to show how uniquely positioned and the benefits of open source, because we can deal with these things quickly. But it also has unique challenges here, like you mentioned. You said nobody wants to wake up in the morning writing insecure software. Well, Gia Tan did, I guess, that day. So there are people out there that are doing this. And I always say open source is great because anyone on the internet can help. But if you spend 10 minutes on the internet, you realize not everyone there is a nice person. So it's sort of terrifying for that exact same reason. But yeah, the rest of it all makes perfect sense. Open source comes with no liability. And I think tying back beyond just CISA's Secure by Design framework back to the White House's overall overarching cybersecurity strategy that attacks us from all angles, liability has to stop somewhere, and the liability reform, I think, is going to be a big piece of this, because you can pretend that it's free as in beer, but it's really a puppy running around causing havoc. I think liability is going to be a major tool there to really fix the way that companies think about open source and maintenance.
And Dan, thank you for the reframe of open source is not unique in this, because I know that in my head and sometimes forget to say that.
Yeah,
but
I have to say it every time because otherwise somebody calls me out on it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and to exactly those points, I think, as Dan just said, really the XE compromise highlighted the benefits that we get from open source software, because what's to say this would have been caught in a timely manner if this was in closed source software. With open source, we have that ability for scrutiny from really any developer worldwide. And I think that's a key security benefit of it. But really what the XC compromise gets to at the end of the day is one of sustainability, because we need to figure out how we can continue ensuring that this really global community of open source developers, whether they're individual hobbyists, whether they belong to a company, whether it's a nonprofit organization, how we can help to make sure that this community is well prepared to both continuing to produce the software that we all rely upon, but then also to make kind of these kind of to build in security from the start and make security improvements where needed. And that's something we've been working on at CISA to see how we can help these communities scale out security improvements. One example that I'll call out is I mentioned briefly that we had package managers, package repositories at our summit we held. And for those unfamiliar, a package repository is essentially the place where any developer will go to download and use open source software. So if I'm writing code, I want to use an open source package, I will get it from the package repository, which allows the open source maintainers who build that package to put it out there to the world. So these package repositories are both really central locations in the open source ecosystem, and as a result, that makes them targets to attacks. But it also means that they have a really great ability to scale out security improvements across ecosystems. And we've seen some, for example, take actions to require multi-factor authentication from their maintainers to prioritize the security of everyone who depends on that, to make it harder to compromise a maintainer's account and hence compromise the packages they depend on. So at CISA, we partnered with a working group of the Open Source Security Foundation around publishing guidance towards package repositories with security principles. And we've since been working with them to really understand what their roadmap to adoption looks like. At our open source summit about a month ago, we highlighted how 5 of the major package repositories are taking actions in line with this framework to really kind of up-level and improve security for everyone. So it's an area we're going to continue working on, but we want to see what are other areas we can drive forward at CISA and how can we encourage every company to do the same, because this is a global resource.
Great.
Yeah, I'll just echo that one really quick. Yeah, that OpenSSF working group for package managers is one of my favorite things going on the internet right now. It's a small group of people responsible for critical infrastructure that powers open source, which is the critical infrastructure that powers everything else. And they're making changes and they're talking together and sharing the same problems. And so it's amazing to see the collaboration there.
Yeah.
I really appreciate the points you all have made, definitely around like who are intermediaries who we can work with kind of in the open source space to help drive up security around the ecosystem. As well as Dan, your point about liability, I think is really interesting. We've been talking about software liability recently. I don't want to assume, but I would guess that most of the folks on this call are very opposed to liability for open source developers. But when you get into proprietary software that uses and incorporates open source, then you can start thinking about where can liability drive better, more responsible, more sustainable consumption. Let me pose my next question to Lauren and then to Jack. It won't surprise anyone on this call if I say that the recent Cyber Safety Review Board report on Microsoft's cloud compromise over the summer wasn't great. It revealed something like a cascade of security flaws, from unimplemented key rotation to misimplemented bounds checks that basically allowed a consumer key to serve as a source of trust in broader enterprise environments, including US Department of State email inboxes. So I'd love to hear you guys talk a little bit about whether and how you see Secure by Design is addressing like those kind of flaws that stacked up in that context. And then Sarah and Dan, I'll have a question for you on the flip side of this. So Lauren?
Sure. Well, what I think we're really getting at here, at least in the context of your question, is it really goes back to principle number 3 for Secure by Design, which is to lead from the top. And what that means is that companies need to have this executive sponsorship of security by design. Not just like leadership buy-in, not just say, yeah, this is, something that we're gonna, start featuring. Like, it has to be something that is a stated business goal, stated business priority from the beginning. And so that way, I think that you do get to a security first culture with those sorts of things. So earlier I mentioned making the right investments in the company, right? So things like creating secure developer ecosystems, things like incentivizing your employees to, to be transparent, right? And to develop things with security, in mind and as a priority. And having this sort of investment and having this sort of attention, I think, really goes back to the economics issue of it, right? So making sure that we're having these investments, into the company to create this, I think, robust security culture. And so yeah, that to me is where secure by design, at least in this particular context, really, really drives the argument forward. And I'll turn to Jack too for his thoughts on it.
Great. So the only other thing I would add is that kind of one of the areas we can't be clear enough in is when we're talking about things that software manufacturers should do about their product versus what they should be doing as an enterprise. And traditionally, cybersecurity guidance has focused largely on the enterprise side. And while, of course, with our secure by design guidance, we are really looking to emphasize what should be done on the product security side to ensure that the products that wind up in customers' hands are built in a secure by design manner. We also have to acknowledge that enterprise security is a core part of secure by design. And really what this gets towards is if you kind of, our colleague Bob Lord uses a factory analogy for this, where if you can't secure kind of the doors to your factory, then how can you be sure that the products coming out of that factory are secure? And these are two closely related ideas, but we want to be really clear when we're talking about what manufacturers should be doing about the products they build, in addition to what they should be doing about their enterprise security, because both of these are ultimately necessary. And at CISA, we have guidance on both. For instance, our secure by design guidance I mentioned gets really towards that product security side, but we also have, for instance, our cross-sector cybersecurity performance goals, which covers enterprise security, and even our recent self-attestation form kind of gets to that aspect of how can organizations building software secure the means by which they build that software? How can they secure those built environments? How can they make sure that kind of when it goes from code to a deployed application, that it is being built in a secure manner?
Great. Yeah, I appreciate those points. The point about that, the security of products and the security of an organization producing those products are like that is very well taken. Turning maybe to Sarah and then to Dan, you've both kind of seen security engineering at small corporations and also large corporations, including things like cloud hyperscalers, and Microsoft is about as big as it gets. I'm curious what kinds of unique challenges you guys see for these largest tech firms in terms of implementing something like the secure by design principles and working on software security generally, and kind of how you would think about like how those challenges could sort of be addressed for those largest players. I think you may be muted.
I am, and I fixed that. Thank you. Yes, there are so many possibilities here. I will always point back to the culture of the organization and where that organization is in sort of its growth. So we have technology as a software technology as an industry is still very adolescent, let's be clear. Like it's been around maybe 40 years. Many of the companies we're talking about in big companies as an industry are still less than 25 years old. And that means that they have a culture based on what did work and what has been successful for them. And then some of them are transitioning. Microsoft has gone through multiple transitions like this. There was the first initiative on trustworthy computing, and now there's initiatives on, the large scale cybersecurity around services and around the products delivered to their own customers. All of that needs to happen with cultural evolution. I think it was Lauren who was talking about top down. There has to be key leadership and acceptance for this growth and the challenges, because there will be challenges as you grow through this, as you're making these changes. But also you need to make sure that the incentives are aligned for the middle group. Because it's great if a boss says do a thing, but then if you as a middle manager are rewarded for doing something different, that's not, the lip service is there, but the actual social economics of it aren't there. And we see this same sort of thing with, as I mentioned earlier, with the security researchers and where their incentives are lined up. Like you have to be extra good to overcome the success conditioning of some of our large tech organizations, because, well, we've gotten here, we must be doing it right, is not a position we can take anymore.
Yeah, I think when you look at hyperscalers, and not just hyperscalers, but large companies, I would say large enterprises, all of that, I think the challenges come in just because every large company is comprised of a whole bunch of small teams, a whole bunch of small organizations, maybe even a whole bunch of small companies through acquisitions, mergers, all of that. Google did an amazing job at embracing and kind of pioneering a lot of the secure by design stuff back in 2010, 2012, after all of the nation state attacks started. But the biggest weak point was mergers and acquisitions, companies that you're buying and merging in that didn't have that culture and merging all of that later on. And for companies that are comprised of a whole bunch of small teams, some might have only been around a year or two and can be more forward thinking, versus some that are more legacy and working on something much older. Trying to map these principles to different teams in different stages and different maturity in their product development cycle is one of the bigger challenges.
You always need people who are at the forefront, busy in the middle maintaining and cleaning up after your software. Like you need all three pieces or all three different characteristics at every stage of the life of a company, but only some are rewarded at varying points, especially in companies that are established.
We're going to transition at this point from panel discussion time to audience Q&A. The great news is that the audience has done a fantastic job generating questions, so we have a lot of material to cover. And it'll look more or less the same, but I give my many thanks to all the audience members who submitted questions. And I'm actually going to start with one that is related kind of to what we were just talking about, and I'd be interested in anyone's perspective on this. Who are the companies, or what types of companies, that it's most important adopt secure by design principles because many other tech vendors rely on them? Should CISA take special interest or take a different approach or authorities when kind of interacting with them?
I think that's a tricky one because the supply chain is incredibly intertwined. We're all somewhere in the middle of it. If you're producing software, then someone else is using it, and someone else is using their software. And the kind of landmark attack on SolarWinds a few years ago really showed how that transitive property applies. Yeah, there are some that are more critical than others, but everyone is important and everyone is an attack vector and everyone is a weak link. So it's hard to really pick one group out.
Yeah, I would totally say that web of both the technical challenges and we've seen through XZ the social challenges, and of course phishing and all of the other things in individual compromises. Like this is a really complex web that will continue to need everyone to be vigilant and figure out ways to move the best possible outcomes forward and reward them.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I'm not going to speak on sort of the authorities or special attention part, but I will say, from my perspective, I agree. The supply chain compromises are, I think, especially pernicious and really worrying. You know, if we think back to the compromise that happened in the healthcare sector about a month or two ago, right? You had this, one company with the technology that was actually compromised, but the real victims, in my opinion, were all the downstream users and the downstream recipients, I guess, of that particular technology, and then of course the patients. Um, and so, even though the work was being done to kind of fix that, for those actual victims, the healthcare providers, there really wasn't much that they could do at that point. And so that's where I really start to worry, is like that particular area, and how we can ensure that those entities in critical infrastructure where people's lives are truly relying on these services are safeguarded.
Yeah, the supply chain piece of this is so difficult. I've been thinking about this a lot since the CISA compromise a few weeks back. Like, who would have thought that a random business intelligence company would be holding kind of the keys to the front door, the keys to the kingdom for a bunch of other companies, which then get popped, and that kind of like percolates out to their customers. Like, that kind of supply chain risk, I think, is potentially really hard to be kind of like tracking and identifying, which kind of supports the thesis that, it's probably useful to us to try to understand these supply chains and to try to understand, places that might be particular nodes of vulnerability, but to some extent, like, everyone's security kind of has to come up to a certain level to really reduce kind of supply chain related risk.
Maya, to your point about the nodes, there are some natural funnel points in this. Obviously, you have languages. So, like, where your computer language, we've heard about could we eliminate the entire class of memory safe issues by moving toward memory safe language. So you have languages, you have companies who have large ability to engage with the software they build, or require different things, different characterizations of software, different improvements in software from their vendors. You also have, to the point about the open source stewards, foundations, which can bring these principles together. You also have governments who can bring us our, potential liability changes or our regulatory stick involved in this. So where we all have to work together still has some really nice nexuses. Package managers, Dan mentioned them. They're a fantastic node, like nexus point for all of this work that needs to come together. And those are the points, I think, where the effort needs to be driven, so that the broader mesh of everyone looking at this more carefully, it aren't all individually trying to fix tiny things. They're trying to find where the biggest effort, biggest reward for the effort put in exists.
Yeah, and just to quickly tack on to that, one of the key pillars of our open source roadmap I mentioned previously, kind of looking at this in the open source space, is understanding the prevalence of open source software that's depended on by both the federal government and critical infrastructure. And it's an area that we're actively working on, with the recognition that if we want to see what the highest leverage points that we can really help secure are, we need to understand what we are dependent on as a country. So in addition to some of the work with package repositories I mentioned, we're also looking to see how we can get a better baseline understanding of what we're most reliant on.
Yeah, I like that initiative a lot. It's been something that we've been really excited to see in the ecosystem. Let me pose another question, maybe more directed at our CISA friends, but anyone can jump in and answer, which is, who's going to pay for all of this investment? It seems like consumer demand is still not enough to reward, more secure products, and there may also be a problem of, not being able to evaluate how much one product is more secure than another. If it's an upfront cost, will companies take that on? And, do you think that they'll be rewarded for that down the line?
I think this time. Go ahead.
I'll just start and say, look, as I mentioned at the top of this, there is going to be some upfront investment here. And so, as we look at these, misaligned incentives, and, as we look at the speed to market and the features that have been prioritized over security, I think, it's going to take leaders and market movers to truly reshape things. And, by being bold, by having this bias for action, by, having these new ideas, and really even being first movers. And so, look, I think that, there a lot of these technology companies do have the ability to make these strategic investments. Now, look, do I think that there are some areas to be explored here? Yeah, absolutely. When people say, well, we have to charge for something like, we'll just say SSO, for instance, single sign-on access. Do we have to accept that as gospel? Like, what are the sort of forces within these particular features or particular configurations that we should explore? Is this something that we could innovate on? I mentioned innovation at the top. I think when we talk about how, certain things might harm innovation, I think that really does a disservice to people who are very innovative and technically minded, and says that, we not, innovate on these, very important areas too. So I think, there will have to be some investment, but I think really diving in and seeing where we can, make some really interesting decisions and explore things, and really start to unravel, what are the forces that, make something the way it is now, and what can we change, because we can do hard things.
And I'll flip that question just a bit to who pays for insecure software today, because it's not like there are no costs right now. It's just that they are by and large borne on the customers, the end users, the people least equipped to make improvements. And we see that whether it's needing to pay for extra security features, whether it's needing to have staff to constantly patch vulnerabilities that come out, whether it's needing to buy security products just to use the products that you buy securely, or whether it's the cost of a breach, which feels nearly inevitable today, and paying a ransom and instant response, and all the, not to mention kind of business downtime and associated impacts. So it's all these areas, which leads us to the hypothesis we have at CISA, where the cost of secure by design software, of building it into the start, aren't zero. There are real costs associated with it, but we believe they're vastly lower than the current costs that are borne by customers today. So when we talk about eliminating entire classes of vulnerabilities, and I had a recent piece in the Harvard Business Review around this, looking at ransomware attacks. And one of the things I offered there is that every business building software should undertake an assessment of classes of vulnerabilities present in their product, looking at two things. First, what is the current amount of harm, of damage that is and can be caused by that class of vulnerability? And second, what is the level of cost that would be required to eliminate that class of vulnerability at scale? And I think what companies will find is that there are many areas where there can be cost-effective approaches taken that can vastly improve the security of their customers. Just to give one example of SQL injection vulnerabilities, which were in the news, particularly last year, leading to one of the major strings of ransomware exploitation. We've seen from companies who are able to eliminate SQL injection vulnerabilities at relatively low cost across their products. This isn't anything new. We've known how to eliminate these vulnerabilities for over 2 decades. So we think, for instance, with SQL injection, that can be a relatively low cost, high impact action. Other areas like memory safety are absolutely necessary. That's likely a bit of a longer term issue and approach, given that requires rewriting code in memory safe languages. But still, at the very least, companies can start thinking about how they want to prioritize their transition, how they might be able to start switching to readily available memory safe alternatives of open source libraries, how they might be able to start prioritizing rewrites, and so on, to, again, build in better security for their customers.
And I want to make sure, Dan, if you wanted
Yeah.
to share what you want to share before I jump to the next.
Oh yeah, mostly some of the same, right? It's a negative externality where the cost today is borne on consumers when their data gets breached or their accounts get stolen or their identities get stolen or something. The liability reform initiatives, I think, make a lot of sense there to help push the cost back upstream. And I don't, to echo your other point, I don't believe that it's going to be vastly more expensive to do secure by design software. It's not like the price of everything is going to go up 10x when people have to start writing secure software or anything. It's a matter of pushing that up because the market is really bad at pricing security in at the end because these risks are so rare and so infrequent and very hard to model. But if we do this right, if we push the accountability to where it needs to be, then the market will sort it out, and then we can do hard things, like you said a minute ago, Lauren. We can figure out a way to do this without dramatically increasing our costs because the market will keep prices down.
Let me jump in on this topic of doing hard things, creating accountability. We got a really geeky question, which I have to ask because it's very interesting. So this anonymous asker says, my car has had for years an unpatched remote root exploit in its open source software dependencies. I'm a software industry professional and I do investigate my vendor options, but I'm not seeing a great opportunity to demand better via my purchasing in most market verticals. Is it realistic to aim for improvement without a stronger compliance regime, given a very poor baseline on software developers self-regulating their art, especially in areas where software has not been the primary value proposition of the product, things like automobiles, healthcare, energy, and yet which are obviously critical in society?
Can you tell me where the
I
car's
feel-
parked? No. You can go, Sarah.
I feel like this is that sort of market transition that we're in. We have customers becoming more aware of the risks that they drive around with and understanding that they need to require more of these businesses. But you have these businesses, again, cars are a perfect example, not to be mean to cars, but cars are a perfect example here. They don't think of themselves as software companies. Like a car company doesn't think of itself as a software company. It's a vertical unto itself. Yet there is Linux on most cars these days, and in fact, multiple installations of Linuxes running in multiple computers, doing all sorts of things, engaging with your driving in every way. And that's, if you don't think of yourself as a software company, then you are doing a huge disservice to your end users. And that's what we're coming through in that sort of evolution of the technology perception. Is technology is now fundamental. Software technology, I'll even say, because good Lord, a pencil was technology once upon a time. But software technology is now so fundamental and so baked into everything that we do, everything that we use, my refrigerator, my toaster, my car, my airplanes. Like, we need to recognize that software and software security is, if not just a first-class citizen, possibly right up there with physical safety as a thing that needs to be considered in every product.
Yeah, and I'll just say too, I completely empathize with this person's question. I have had a software package needing to be installed on my car, and it is so complicated to do this, and not only complicated but timely. Like, it has to be, I have to allocate like a certain amount of time, and I'm like, I don't have this time. I'm running around like mom, and working and all this stuff. I'm like, I don't have it. And so I think that goes back to this idea of making things easy, and not only for developers but also for customers, right? We have to know how to do things. We have to make it easy, or else we're just not going to have the right kind of awareness and adoption.
This also goes right back to the right to repair as well, which is, do our consumers have the right to repair a thing that they bought? Or is this forever a rental, or forever has to be unlocked by an authorized service provider? Like, all of this lack of transparency, all of this black boxing of our tech does damage to our end consumers, and then even beyond that, their end users. And that is why we have to make this shift. This is no longer a space where the top 1% of developers work for a single company who should tell you how to do this. The top 1% of developers are larger than any of our developer pools in any large company today, whether that's a software company or a manufacturing company that has lots and lots of tiny little computers all over their production floor, doing all sorts of making all sorts of choices for them. Like, we have to think about this in a more holistic and less parental way when we're talking about engaging with software and our consumers and then end users.
Yeah, I really like all the points that you made about how much software is a part of every product. It needs to be kind of like brought into the conversation around software security, needs to be like in the part of those conversations about product safety and security, as well as the point of how do you reduce the number of disruptive patches that individuals or organizations have to apply. I think that's really, really real. One more question I want to ask as we're kind of getting to the end. I think there's a lot of agreement with all the folks on this call, like that we really believe in, the aims of secure by design and the goal of securing software. One question that we got from the audience is basically like, what does success look like? What are the outcomes that we'd want to see and be able to know and say, hey, we really succeeded at secure by design. What numbers would we want to see go down or up?
Yes, so I think this starts with recognizing that we'll never get to a future where we have perfectly secure software. This is something we hear sometimes where it's, well, we can't ever have perfectly secure software, so what are we going to do? But the reality is that the sorts of attacks that we see out there today most often aren't all that sophisticated. They're actually pretty simple. They exploit well-known classes of vulnerabilities and weaknesses that in reality shouldn't be all that hard to prevent. So what we see as success with Secure by Design is a future in which it is dramatically harder for adversaries to exploit some of these really basic vulnerabilities. So we think there is plenty of classes of vulnerabilities that are preventable, as we've talked about several times today. I'll flag that we have a Secure by Design alert series now that discusses some of these known classes of vulnerabilities and steps that manufacturers can take to prevent them at scale. But I do think that a future is possible where we do see some of these classes of vulnerabilities start to go away. And maybe that's me being optimistic, but I think a decade from now, we hopefully can be talking about SQL injections or cross-site scripting or even memory safety vulnerabilities as a thing of the past. And it's going to take time and a lot of work to get there. And there will certainly be some kind of vulnerabilities that persist and continuing challenges. We're never going to totally solve security. We won't pretend we can. But what we can do is make it harder for adversaries to do their job. And especially with challenges like ransomware, where these are businesses being operated, they're quite profitable right now. But if we raise the cost of doing business to them, at some point, they might look to exit the market, so to speak. So we want to see how we can get from kind of where we are today to reasonable baseline of security by which many of these classes of vulnerabilities are way less common.
Yeah, I think, echo everything that Jack said. And, I think as consumers too, or customers of software, going back to the previous question, having an environment where we can truly trust the things that we're using, right? Where, we don't have a lot of questions. We are able to update things a lot more easily, and we're not seeing as many you can look at metrics and measure things in a number of different ways. We can look at money, right, and how much maybe the money stolen went down over a couple decades. But Certainly, I would love to see just measurable increase in safety and incidents going down. And I think if we do our job right, we're going to see that.
I love the idea of trying to measure some of these negative outcomes, you know, the existence of ransomware groups, the instances of successful compromise. You can imagine like the number, percentage of businesses. Like I think that tying kind of the adoption of these controls to those kinds of outcomes, you know, we can see security improving in the ways that we care about. It's a really interesting problem. And it's always something that, you know, on the research side, we're thinking about how do you kind of tie those things together. So I'm curious, Dan, Sarah, like if you have a perspective on this from kind of being often on the security on the technology industry side.
Yeah, I'd throw one in quick. You mentioned earlier on a few minutes ago, Jack, most of these breaches are not sophisticated. They're known attack paths that have been around forever. One way to measure this would just be, we're never going to stop attacks. You said that attacks are going to keep happening. Are the attacks getting more sophisticated over time? Because that would indicate that we're making the job harder for people.
I'll throw in a second metric on this, which is the difference between the reported flaw and the exploit. So 0 day is sort of ideal. We can't really have protected as efficiently as about a 0 day. If no one has heard about this until today, we can't have protected against it in some variations. But if this has been an exploit in a package that had a CVE associated with it 18 months ago, and there are releases of 4 things that have fixed it and 2 that just changed the architecture to make it way better, and you're still on the 18-month-old software, like that delta should be going down. Like the delta between when the possibility of the break was identified to when it was exploited in a particular organization, I think that is a number that needs to be measured as well.
Yeah, and that's funny if you think about it from that perspective, like SQL injection vulnerabilities are like a 3,600 day vulnerability or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Yep.
Great. Okay, we're actually right at time, or 1 minute over. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much to the panelists. I've learned a lot from this conversation. I hope the audience has learned a lot as well. And thank you all so much for coming, sharing your perspectives, and being so thoughtful. And thank you to you, audience, for giving us great questions and for watching along. That's a wrap. I really hope everyone enjoys the rest of their Thursday afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.